Hey, everybody. So we're looking at part 2 of our Brooklyn lecture. In the first part, we talked about the various villages in colonial Brooklyn that turned into some of the neighborhoods that are still there today, like Flatbush and Bushwick, Gravesend, etc. And in the second part of the lecture, I want to talk about a neighborhood called Brooklyn Heights, which is not part of the original 6 villages of Brooklyn. This was much later. So those villages were all founded in the 1600s, and Brooklyn Heights wasn't founded until the early 1800s, early 19th century. And to be precise, it was founded in 1817. So entirely different from the 6 colonial villages. So I want to talk about a little bit about how Brooklyn Heights came to be. It's one of the most important neighborhoods in the city, architecturally speaking. So that's why we're going to study it a little bit. So the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights differs from some of the villages that we talked about, in that it was a much more recent development, and was in response to the dramatic growth of the city in the first decade of the 19th century, which we talked about in reference to the Commissioner's Plan. So the Manhattan was growing by leaps and bounds, and Brooklyn was as well. So there was a demand for housing in Brooklyn Heights because it was so convenient to lower Manhattan, where all the action was in the Wall Street area and the financial district. But it happened pretty late in terms of New York's development. And you can see here that in 1807, which you'll remember was the year that the Commissioner's Plan legislation started for Manhattan, at that point, Brooklyn Heights was still farmland. And all of that was about to change dramatically. So this is our old friend, the Ratzer map from 1766, 67, showing the Brooklyn part of it. And at this point, you can see it's all farmland, basically, except for those colonial villages scattered about. And this area of farmland here is what became, much later, Brooklyn Heights. And here you can see it on the Holland map from 1776. And that object that I've circled there is Fort Sterling, which figured in the Revolutionary War. And you can see here that the topography, Brooklyn Heights gets its name because it was in fact higher, much higher than the river. These are actually, at that point, were cliffs. Now the BQE is running right here, but it was elevated far above the river, which is why they built the fort there. Strategically, that made a lot of sense. Although it didn't work out that way because the Continental Army still lost the Battle of Brooklyn and had to evacuate Brooklyn Heights. But the idea was that Brooklyn Heights was up here on this plateau, and they could command the river and defend Brooklyn, but that, of course, didn't work out. But yeah, the fort was right in the middle of what later became Brooklyn Heights, right along. This is where it is, just showing you on a Google map where it is today. So 1807, it was still farmland, but then the big impetus for developing Brooklyn Heights as an urban neighborhood came in 1814 with the initiation of steamboat ferry service back and forth, the so-called Fulton Ferry, the famous Fulton Ferry named after Robert Fulton. And it connected from Fulton Street in lower Manhattan in the financial district to Fulton Street in Brooklyn. So you'll notice if you look at a map, like a lot of the streets in that part of Brooklyn, the name continues in the Manhattan side. You see that over and over again. So there's a Fulton Street in Manhattan and a Fulton Street in Brooklyn. And this is the Fulton Ferry, which looks very slow and old-fashioned, but in 1814, this meant that people could get across the river much more quickly and predictably because they didn't have to, because it had steam power, obviously. So they didn't have to, they weren't subjected to changes in the wind. This particular Fulton Ferry boat is called the Over. You can see it written on the big flag there. And so this made commuting back and forth from Brooklyn much quicker and much more possible. So it created a demand for development in Brooklyn. This is, of course, far before the Brooklyn Bridge, which we've already talked about. So this is just showing you the path of the ferry from Fulton Street in Manhattan to Fulton Street in Brooklyn. At this point, Brooklyn Heights is owned by some wealthy landowners, and you can see their names. If you go to Brooklyn Heights today, you can see their names commemorated in street names. So there's Pierpont Street. He was one of these landowners. Remsen, he was another landowner. And they owned these big chunks of land, which had been farms, but at this point, they're just sitting on the land, hoping to subdivide it into building lots. And when the Fulton Ferry started in 1814, then the demand went up, and so they could do this. And they started cutting up these big parcels of land into streets and building lots, and they put them on the sale. The first lots went on sale in 1819. I already showed you that. Not sure why I'm showing you that again. Oh, I know. So I know why, because I wanted to orient you geographically with the next map. So here's Brooklyn Heights. And then this is this is where the ferry came in right here. You can see the ferry landing right here and connected to this road, which is still there. This is today's Flatbush Avenue, which connected into the hinterlands of Brooklyn and into some of the outlying villages like Flatbush, which is down here, and Gravesend. And so the ferry came right in there. And so Brooklyn Heights was developed in that land right next to the ferry, which makes sense. It was really convenient for people to get right off the ferry and be able to walk to their houses. So this is the first plan. This is from 1816. So this is right when the first lots were going on sale. And these streets had just been opened. Just to get you oriented. So this is the East River over here. So this is north this way, right? And here's the Fulton Ferry coming in right here. And then here's, I call this Flatbush, sorry. I meant to call it Fulton Street in the last map, but it connects to the street it connects to Flatbush, but at this point it's Fulton Street. And Fulton Street, of course, is still there today. It goes through Brooklyn, and if you've been to what's it called, the Fulton Mall or whatever it's called, the shopping district on Fulton Street. So that's still there today. So so this is the East River over here. So Manhattan would be over here somewhere, right? Over here. Just trying to draw here. Unsuccessfully. This is Manhattan is over here somewhere. You get the idea. So the ferries are, here's the ferry coming over. You get the idea, right? Here's a ferry, these are waves. It's not the best drawing tool. These are the bluffs that I was showing you on the other map. You can see the topography here. So this is high above the river. So, you know, that was another selling point and remains a selling point today for these houses in Brooklyn Heights, is that they were above the river. So they have really majestic views of the harbor and of Manhattan. And then this map is showing you the new streets that were cut through. And it also shows you some of the farm boundaries here that have not been yet developed. So these are, at this point, not farms anymore, but big pieces of land that are still being held. This one you can see is owned by Pierpont. This one's owned by Remsen. Here you can see, here's Remsen Street right here. Here's Pierpont Street. Those streets are all still there. Joralemon Street is here, which is named after the Joralemon family that owned that part of it. Down here is Atlantic Avenue, the famous Atlantic Avenue, which of course goes through all of Brooklyn. And then over here is Red Hook Lane, which connected down to Red Hook, which I think I showed you in the first part of the lecture. And a little fragment of Red Hook Lane is still there, but not much of it. So it's these streets here that we're interested in, that were laid out. You can see that they're, in some places, here's Pineapple Street, Orange Street, Cranberry Street. So those are the so-called fruit streets in Brooklyn Heights, named after fruits. And then here's Middaw Street, Poplar Street. There's Willow Street is running this way here. Willow Street is a really beautiful street. Hicks Street, Henry Street, Clinton Street, et cetera, going. So it's a grid, you know, just like the commissioner's plan. It's the typical grid layout. So I'm reorienting the map so that you can, this is the actual orientation of the map. Oh, this is something I just showed you, but I just want to show you where Fulton Street, the ferry comes in here. So somebody, you know, who buys a house at the corner of Middaw and Willow Street, for instance, could probably work on Wall Street or something, could come home and then they could, it was just a short walk, you know. Here's Willow Street. They could just walk up here to Middaw Street. Let's say they lived here in that beautiful house that's still there. You know, it's a 5-minute walk. Of course, they have to walk uphill from the ferry, which is kind of difficult. It's really hilly right there. But then they have this majestic view of the harbor looking out their window. Oh, this is cool. Another thing I wanted to show you is you can also still see the imprint here. Look at that, of the ruins of Fort Sterling, which were still there in 1816. So how many years after 1776 is that? You do the math, but pretty far after, what, 40 years, 30 years? And it's still there partially. So the ruins were still there. So as this is becoming a city, look at that. The fort is still there partially. And then this is just showing you the arrangement of the streets. Of course, it was a grid with the, in this case, they're not called avenues and streets like the commissioner's plan, they're just all streets. But the major streets here are Clinton up here, Henry, Hicks Street, those are all still there today. And then down here, Willow Street, which is my personal favorite street, beautiful shady street. And we're gonna go on a virtual walking tour down Willow Street next week. And then here's Columbia Street along the river. And at this point, this area down here were commercial docks. So shipping is coming in down there. And there's still a little bit of that, but now it's Brooklyn Bridge Park that's down here. And the BQE was sent through Brooklyn Heights, and it did something like this and cut off part of it. It did that. Thank you, Robert Moses. So Brooklyn Heights, I mean, it's now, if you think about the 5 boroughs, it's in the center of the city. I mean, it's right next to the Brooklyn Bridge. It's a short subway ride away from Wall Street. It's in the thick of things. It couldn't be more urban, right? But it was actually conceived as a suburb. And when it was first built, that's what it was. It was a suburb to Manhattan. It was a planned community, a planned suburb for commuters. And at that point, the rest of Brooklyn was pretty much still farmland and these little colonial villages. But it's strange to think of Brooklyn Heights as a suburb, but that's really what it was. So we have already talked about the Brooklyn Bridge. This happened much later. So Brooklyn Heights is developed. The first lots go on sale in 1817, and the streets are cut through Brooklyn Heights, and buildings start to get built, and a lot of houses. Let me go back for a second. A lot of houses got built in the 1820s. So you'll recall from earlier in the semester, we were talking about the development of Manhattan and how crucial the Erie Canal was to the city's growth, and how there were so many houses built during the so-called canal boom of the 1820s. Well, that wasn't just happening in Manhattan, it was also happening in Brooklyn too. So the steam ferry service allowed quicker commuting back and forth, and the city was also growing at that point. And so a lot of houses in Brooklyn Heights were built in the 1820s. And it interests us architecturally because a lot of those houses are still there today, which we'll look at later. So 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, these buildings are being built in Brooklyn Heights through the Civil War period. And this is all before the Brooklyn Bridge is built, which you'll recall begins, the planning stages begin in the 1860s. And the Brooklyn Bridge isn't finished until 1883. And we talked about this, that once the bridge was built, you could walk across it, you could take a train across it, and you could drive your horse and buggy across it. And so this really hastened the further development of Brooklyn. This was a watershed moment. But I don't want you to get the impression that there was nothing in Brooklyn before the Brooklyn Bridge. That certainly wasn't the case. So Brooklyn Heights, by the time the Brooklyn Bridge was built, Brooklyn Heights was pretty much fully built, a dense neighborhood of row houses. Other neighborhoods were being developed at that point to the south. Park Slope was already a thriving neighborhood. Fort Greene was already a thriving neighborhood. Cobble Hill was already a thriving neighborhood. Red Hook had already developed into this kind of working class dockland neighborhood. So Brooklyn was definitely a city before the Brooklyn Bridge even began construction. So I don't want you to get the impression, and I'm afraid that I may have left you with this impression with the Brooklyn Bridge lecture. I don't want you to have the impression that there was nothing there and then suddenly the Brooklyn Bridge was built and then Brooklyn was developed. In fact, Brooklyn was a thriving city before the bridge even began construction. And in fact, the reason, the whole rationale for building the Brooklyn Bridge was that Brooklyn was such a thriving city. Otherwise, there would have been no reason to build it. So it was really a connection between two thriving cities, Brooklyn and Manhattan. So there was a lot there already. It was a city, but it's definitely true that when the bridge opened in 1883, that just quickened the pace of development that was already going along really well. I mean, it was already rapidly expanding, but the bridge definitely kind of was a tipping point because it was so much easier to get back and forth. And also, so this is an atlas from 1885, so 2 years after the Brooklyn Bridge opens. So I wanted to show this to you also because I want to make sure you understand that the bridge did not negate the ferry. And in fact, you can see all of these ferries. If anything, one of the things that helped Brooklyn's development and the development of Queens as well, and New Jersey, was that there were so many ferries going. And I think the Fulton Ferry was the first one, although maybe the South Ferry was the first one. But the Fulton Ferry continued to operate after the Brooklyn Bridge opened. It's not like there was the ferry era and then the Brooklyn Bridge. That wasn't true at all. And in fact, in the years after the Brooklyn Bridge opened, there were just even ferries were every bit as important as they had been. This is interesting also that on this bridge from, on this map from 1885. So the bridge had only been open 2 years, and you can see here they didn't know what to call it on the map. They were just labeled it Suspension Bridge. And that goes back to the reading where they're like, what do we call it? Is it the Empire Bridge? Is it the Roebling Bridge? Is it the Brooklyn Bridge? Is it the New York Brooklyn Bridge? What is it? So the name at this point was, they just labeled it Suspension Bridge. So here's the Wall Street Ferry. That was another really important ferry. And it connected to Montague Street, which became like the main drag of Brooklyn Heights, and still is that kind of main street of Brooklyn Heights with shopping and restaurants and things like that. And then that, it was just a quick connection to Fulton Street, you see here. And of course, on to Wall Street on the Manhattan side. So the Wall Street Ferry was really important. There's also the South Ferry, which connected into, you can see here is Atlantic Avenue, which became this major thoroughfare in Brooklyn, and of course still is, and went all the way out east, miles and miles, 10 miles or more east. I already showed you that Suspension Bridge. So here's the where the Brooklyn Bridge terminated on the, and you know this from the reading already, which is that it terminated right at City Hall. So here's City Hall Park, and came right into Fulton Street here. So Fulton Street was a major thoroughfare, and City Hall Park was where the action was. So that was very intentional that the bridge went in that path connecting to Fulton Street. Excuse me. And so the Brooklyn Bridge was built right next to Brooklyn Heights. But at this point, Brooklyn Heights was pretty much like it is today, because those buildings had all been built in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, well before the bridge. But then after the bridge was built, Brooklyn Heights continued to get developed, and a lot of those first generation of houses started getting torn down in favor of newer, bigger houses, and then in the 20th century, apartment buildings. So this is an atlas I wanted to show you just to underscore the point that Brooklyn was a self-contained, thriving city before the bridge opened. So this is 3 years before 1880. I just wanted you to kind of see what Brooklyn looked like, what the plan of it looked like. So this is the area, this is Brooklyn Heights right here. The orientation might confuse you, like this is the East River over here, north is this way. So here's the Fulton Ferry right here. There's the ferry terminal, so the ferries were coming right here. That's right where John Roebling was killed, right? He was standing about here or maybe over here somewhere, and that's when the ferry crushed his foot, which ended up killing him. So that's the Fulton Ferry, and then here's Fulton Street going here, whoops. And you can see how developed this area is. I mean, you know, there's factories, there's oil refineries, there's a a tobacco storehouse here, which is still there today. The Empire Stores warehouse, also still there today. And all of these warehouses along the docks here, up here. Most of those are gone now, but you know, it was a thriving city. There's houses, there's churches, there's theater down here, the Brooklyn Theater. And then you can see, here's the, let me get rid of some of this stuff if I can. Erase, erase, erase. Get the pen back. Okay, so this is one of the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge. You can see right there. And so it's not finished yet. This is 3 years before it's finished. And here is the anchorage over here. Look at how big it is. So that's the anchorage with streets going. York Street goes through it as a tunnel. And here Main Street goes through, and that's still true today. Still there. And so if you're here on Fulton Street and you go this way, you would go underneath the tunnel. So this is the anchorage. I mean, you can see how out of scale it is to, you know, the rest of the city, where like this is like a typical building lot right there. You know, like houses are about like that big. This thing was totally like a spaceship landing on the city, and that's only part of it. That's the anchorage. It's a tower. So the bridge was actually from Adams Street, I think, all the way here. Like it's just so huge compared to everything that's around it. And then this is another map I just want to show you quickly. This is out to the east. This is Fort Greene, which is a considerable ways east of Fulton Ferry and Brooklyn Heights and all that stuff. But you can see here that this is a pretty much fully built neighborhood of row houses. The pink ones you can see means they're brick, and the yellow ones are wood. So you can see there's almost every block is fully built with houses around Fort Greene Park, which back then was called Washington Park. So, I mean, this is 1880, 3 years before the Brooklyn Bridge is finished and opens. And Fort Greene as a neighborhood is basically like Fort Greene is today. These great brownstones and Italianate row houses centered around an urbane public park. So definitely a city. So I don't want you to get the impression that Brooklyn was a blank slate before the Brooklyn Bridge. Definitely not. So I would love to spend a lot of time talking about the subway. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and just mention the subway very briefly. We're not going to have time for like a full-on lecture about the history of the subway this semester, but I wanted to talk about the subway in relationship to Brooklyn's development just really quickly. So we have, you know, different innovations in transportation that profoundly affect Brooklyn's growth. So 1814, the steam ferry, plus the Wall Street ferry and the South Ferry. So Brooklyn is sutured to Manhattan over the water, and then Brooklyn Bridge in 1883. And those are really important developments, but nothing like the development of the subway. And when the subway comes to Brooklyn, then it truly is subsumed into the city, the greater New York, the city of greater New York, I'm trying to say. And so there were 4 tunnels that were built gradually, beginning with the Joralemon Street Tunnel in 1908. So the subway system begins in Manhattan in 1904. So now we're jumping ahead all the way into the 20th century. And then next lecture, we're going to go back in time again to the 1820s. So I hope you keep this chronology straight. I'm kind of going back and forth in time. So the subway opens in Manhattan in 1904, and 4 years later, the subway is extended to Brooklyn through the Joralemon Street Tunnel. And then in 1919, 11 years later, it gets a second tunnel, which is the Clark Street tunnel, which you can see here in that photograph. That's the Clark Street stop in Brooklyn Heights. This is kind of a blurry plan, but this is the original. You can see Manhattan, the original subway line that opened in 1904, and then we get the original tunnels, the Joralemon Street Tunnel here, and then the second one is the Clark Street Tunnel right here. And both of them connected into Borough Hall, or as it was originally called City Hall, Brooklyn City Hall, today's Borough Hall, and that became this point of connection, and it still is today, of course. And then this later, the city of Brooklyn, sorry, the borough of Brooklyn gets two more tunnels, which is the Montague Street Tunnel in 1920, and then the Cranberry Street Tunnel in 1933. So it gets 4 tunnels, all of them going into Brooklyn Heights. And this had a profound impact on the entire borough of Brooklyn, because people could get back and forth so much more quickly, and the subway could carry so many more people, you know, millions of people ride the subway. And in terms of Brooklyn Heights, then what had been this small scale neighborhood of houses from the early to mid 19th century then starts getting redeveloped with bigger and bigger apartment buildings in response to the development brought by the subway. So you can see here all of the subway lines are now going into Brooklyn Heights and into Brooklyn. There's the Joralemon Street Tunnel here, connecting from Lower Manhattan along Joralemon Street and then into Borough Hall. And that's today's 4 and 5 line on the subway. And then you have a little bit later in 1919, the Clark Street Tunnel, stopping at Clark Street in Brooklyn Heights right here. Oops. And then also connecting to Borough Hall. And that's today's 2 and 3 line. And then here's the 1920 Montague Street Tunnel. Which went right down Montague Street, and there is a station at Court Street and also one at Borough Hall. And that's today's N&R train, the Never and the Rarely. And then finally we have the Cranberry Street Tunnel, which opens in the northern part of Brooklyn Heights and has a stop at High Street here. And that's today's A and C line. So that's the subway, and it had a dramatic effect on the whole borough of Brooklyn, but it kind of really changed Brooklyn Heights forever, because Brooklyn Heights had been a suburb, then it was kind of absorbed into the city, but was still pretty small scale. Subway comes and it's right in the thick of things, and the land gets much more valuable. It was valuable already, but it gets much more valuable. And they start building bigger and bigger apartment buildings. So you can see here that, you know, about half of those pre-Civil War buildings from the first couple of generations of Brooklyn Heights were torn down in the 20th century after the subway ripped through the neighborhood, and after also the BQE was put through in the 1950s. So a lot of Brooklyn Heights was demolished. But in terms of the bigger city, there are still over 600 buildings in that neighborhood that date from the era before the Civil War, 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that's extraordinary for New York, because you know, you've seen a recurring theme in this class, which is that things get built, things get torn down, things get built, things get torn down. An entire landscape is erased. Creeks are covered over. hills are cut down, streets are put through, other streets are erased. There's these layers and layers, this kind of relentless development of the city. So it's kind of extraordinary that even half of the buildings in Brooklyn Heights survived from that era. And that's really why we care about it, because it's a historic district. It is literally a historic district. And so now we're skipping way ahead, almost into my lifetime. 1965, Brooklyn Heights becomes New York's first historic district. So what is a historic district? So this was in response to the Robert Moses era. It was in response to things like the Cross Bronx Expressway, the BQE, these giant out-of-scale expressways that were being put through neighborhoods and destroying neighborhoods. It was in response to kind of this runaway development of gargantuan modern projects, public housing projects, private housing projects, low-income housing, middle-income housing, upper-income apartment buildings, and office buildings that were of an entirely different scale, not just style, but scale of the 19th century. So things like row houses from 1820s, or like a carriage house from the 1840s, in the 20th century seemed like relics from a civilization that didn't exist anymore, and they weren't generally valued very much. So, but there was a kind of a backlash to that started in earnest in the 1950s, so that by the mid 1960s, there was a groundswell of opinion that some of this heritage should be saved. And this was the first time that this became actually part of the government structure. So there was the Landmarks Preservation Commission that was founded in 1965 and was given legal discretion to preserve individual buildings and entire parts of the city, which are historic districts. And in a historic district, it meant that the exteriors of buildings at least had to be preserved. So a house owner couldn't decide on their own to tear down a building and build something else without approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The interiors don't really apply. So a lot of these historic houses that are still there, I mean, I see this all the time, that the inside of them gets completely ripped out and they're gutted, and basically a new modern building is put inside, but at least they preserve the shell and they have to preserve the facade and everything. So there are legal restrictions associated with historic districts and individual historic landmarks. And this started in 1965, and Brooklyn Heights was the very first historic district, which shows you how significant it was architecturally. And the housing in Brooklyn Heights is extraordinary. These examples are all over the 5 boroughs here and there, but Brooklyn Heights is probably the best example, along with probably Greenwich Village, of an intact environment, a whole streetscape that is relatively intact. So that you see not just like one federal period building or Greek Revival building, but you see several in a row. So the earliest housing from Brooklyn Heights is from the so-called federal period, which is in Brooklyn Heights means from the 1820s, but the federal period began more like in the late 18th century. And then there's also the Greek Revival period, the Gothic Revival, and the Italianate and others. So we're gonna look at those in some detail next week. And we're gonna focus on the federal period first and then the Greek Revival. We're gonna look at federal housing and buildings in the 5 boroughs, but then we're gonna focus our attention on Brooklyn Heights, especially. So next week, I'm going to talk about Federal period, the Greek Revival, and you're also going to go on a virtual walking tour with me through Brooklyn Heights. Normally, pre-pandemic, we would go ourselves in person, but this is the next best thing. Okay, thanks, guys.